Hi, welcome to this episode of Patient Education for the Educated Patient. This is going to be a two-part video series addressing the results of the ARRIVE trial. The ARRIVE trial was published in 2018 and it generated a lot of controversy. It also generated a lot of buzz in the media and on the internet. And I have patients coming to me asking if they should be induced at 39 weeks to lower their chance of a C-section, because a lot of patients out there don't want a C-section. They want to do everything they can to minimize their chance of winding up with a C-section. So the ARRIVE trial had separated patients into two groups. One group was electively induced at the 39th week of pregnancy, and the other group was randomized into waiting for spontaneous labor to happen or for some other indication to force a induction of labor or delivery of the baby. And the study compared the two groups to look at the outcomes for both the babies and the moms. And what they had concluded was that everybody had benefits if they were electively induced in the 39th week of pregnancy. So you can imagine why there is so much controversy surrounding those conclusions. So I'm going to address both why you should be induced at the 39th week and why you should not be induced at the 39th week in part 2 of this video series. So let's talk about part 1. These are the reasons why you should be induced at 39 weeks. So when you're at 39 weeks, everybody has the decision whether or not to stay pregnant or go ahead and have the baby. There's advantages and disadvantages from the patient standpoint for both of those options. But here we're going to address the scientific data supporting one or the other decision. In this part of this two-part series, we're going to talk about the decision to go ahead and induce the pregnancy at 39 weeks of pregnancy. So again, this is in response to the ARRIVE trial. The ARRIVE trial was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2018. Large randomized trial, thousands of patients, several different labor and deliveries. It split a group of patients randomly into two groups. One that was induced in the 39th week of pregnancy, and the second was allowed to continue routine expectant management, waiting for spontaneous labor or some other reason to induce the delivery or deliver by cesarean section. So these are the summary points of why you should be induced between 39 weeks and 0 days and 39 weeks and 4 days. The reason there's a 5-day window here is because the ARRIVE trial was designed in such a way that patients were ultimately induced during this 5-day window. So summary point number 1, babies who were induced had less need for respiratory support within the first 3 days of life. They found a 29% reduction in the number of babies that required respiratory support. Number 2, the C-section rate was statistically significantly lower and showed a 16% reduction in the rate of C-sections for patients who were electively induced in the 39th week of pregnancy. The third thing, patients spent less time in the hospital overall if they chose to be induced in the 39th week of pregnancy. This is because of the lower C-section rate, which had a lower and shorter hospital stay after the delivery, even though they stayed on labor and delivery longer. The fourth thing is there was a lower chance of developing hypertensive diseases of pregnancy if you chose to be induced at the 39th week of pregnancy. They noticed a 36% reduction in the risk of hypertensive diseases of pregnancy, and that includes gestational hypertension, preeclampsia, with and without severe features, and even things like HELLP syndrome. The fifth point, there were also possibly fewer operative vaginal deliveries, and we'll talk about that more specifically and why I added that in there when there is not a specific conclusion from the authors of this study that there was a difference in the operative vaginal delivery rates. But I'll show you the way I look at the data and why I believe there is a statistically significant lower risk of operative vaginal deliveries. And this includes vacuum-assisted vaginal deliveries and forceps-assisted vaginal deliveries. And overall, they had seen a 18% lower risk of needing operative vaginal delivery. And finally, there's going to be fewer stillbirths if you induce everybody at 39 weeks of pregnancy. And we'll address that in a separate video. So this is the ARRIVE trial. It, again, took patients and decided either wait and treat patients like we always have, or go ahead and, quote, electively induce them at 39 weeks of pregnancy and see what happens. Again, there was a 5-day window for the induction, starting at 39 weeks and 0 days to 39 weeks and 4 days. So the strengths of this study and the reasons why we like it are, number one, there was 41 labor and delivery units spread across the United States. There was no set management style, which allowed for flexibility in the management of patients when it came to both induction and expectant management. The third thing is a randomized trial. The fourth thing is a very large trial with over 6,000 patients enrolled. And the last thing was cervix favorability did not make a difference in the outcome. So these patients did not have to be stratified by their cervical exam, which has been shown to have a high degree of disagreement between different observers and practitioners. So the strengths of this study, this is the good parts of the study. Number one, it's generalizable to the United States. A lot of critics are international. They criticize the amount of obesity and the younger age of these patients that were in this study are not a reflection of their patient population. So this may not apply internationally because we know that the United States has a higher risk of obesity, but that doesn't mean we can't apply it to our practice here in the United States. Flexible management. The protocol designed by the authors was to be very flexible in terms of both induction and expectant management. There was no set protocol for either the induction portion or the expectant management. There was no hard stop on when to induce, why to induce, how to induce, when to do a C-section and give up on induction. And so this is a potential strength of the study because it allowed practitioners to treat patients individually and based on their own judgment. Here they say they specifically designed the trial to allow for management that was consistent with acceptable care, such as that expressed in the bulletin from the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. This was a randomized trial. They had good randomization results, which helps alleviate any potential bias. The only difference between the groups was a history of pregnancy loss. And I'm not sure how that would affect the outcomes or the conclusions of this study. This is a very large study. There was 6,106 patients enrolled in this study. So this is much larger than the other study looking at elective induction at 39 weeks done in the United Kingdom. They had enrolled 619 patients and all their patients were over 35 years old. So this is a much, much larger study, the largest study of its kind that has ever been done. And again, the cervical exam did not matter because there is a lot of disagreement between practitioners when it comes to cervical exam. So the cervical exam did not factor in to the results or the outcomes of the study. So let's talk about the benefits specifically of induction in the 39th week of pregnancy. Number one, there was less respiratory support needed for babies in the first 3 days of pregnancy if they were induced electively in the 39th week of pregnancy. There was no difference in the overall composite scores, but if you look at them broken down individually, you can see here that the respiratory support was significantly reduced by about 29%. The second thing is lower cesarean section rates. There was a 16% reduction in the C-section rate if you were induced in the 39th week. You can see that here. The C-section rate was 18.6% in the induction group and 22.2% in the expectant management group. Less time in the hospital. Again, even though you're on labor and delivery longer when you're being induced, because of the lower C-section rate, as a whole, this group had a shorter hospital stay because you're in the hospital much shorter because you spend much less time on postpartum when you're delivered vaginally versus by C-section. So the difference in C-section rates led to an overall decrease in the postpartum stay and the overall hospitalization stay. Fewer hypertensive diseases of pregnancy. Again, this includes preeclampsia, gestational hypertension, HELP syndrome, etc. So when you're induced, instead of waiting, you tend to prevent the development of more hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. And they showed a 36% reduction in hypertensive disorders, a rate of 9.1% versus 14.1%. Fewer operative vaginal deliveries. Now, this is a possibility because this was not a conclusion that the authors had drawn on this study. But you can look here at the operative delivery rates that they published of 7.3% and 8.5%. They took the number of operative deliveries and divided it by the number of patients in that arm. However, I think a more accurate representation of the operative vaginal delivery rate should have been the number of operative vaginal deliveries divided by the number of patients who were delivered vaginally. So you have to exclude the patients delivered by C-section. I admit I'm not a statistician. There's probably good reason why they chose to do their math this way. But again, I feel like it's a better reflection of the operative vaginal delivery rate if you exclude patients delivered by C-section. This was probably done because of a numbers needed to treat or intention to treat analysis. But if you look at the math, when you look at the operative vaginal delivery rate specific to patients with vaginal deliveries by taking out the number of C-sections, you get 8.9% in the induction group versus 10.9% in the expected management group, which leads to an 18% risk reduction overall, which is statistically significant in this case. Fewer stillbirths. Again, this study is not powered or designed to show a reduction in stillbirths, but another follow-up study to the RIVE trial has been published analyzing the number of stillbirths that induction of labor in the 39th week of pregnancy would prevent in this country. And we'll talk about that paper and those conclusions in a separate video altogether from this two-part video series. So in summary, why you should be induced at 39 weeks of pregnancy. Number one, babies require less respiratory support in the first 3 days of life if you are induced. Number two, the C-section rate is lower if you choose to be induced. And that can be a combination of a smaller baby and a healthier placenta so that the baby's tolerating labor better. Number three, patients spend less time in the hospital overall if they choose to be induced at 39 weeks. Number four, you have a less chance of developing preeclampsia, gestational hypertension, etc. if you choose to be induced in the 39th week of pregnancy. Number five, there's less operative vaginal deliveries if you choose to be induced, and there's going to be less stillbirths if you choose to be induced at 39 weeks instead of waiting. Hopefully this helps you understand why the authors of this study concluded that everybody should be induced at 39 weeks based on the outcomes of this study. Stay tuned and watch the second part of this two-part video series so you can see why this study is controversial and why you should not be induced at 39 weeks of pregnancy. Thank you for watching this episode of Patient Education for the Educated Patient. I hope you found this content both helpful and meaningful, and that you'll be able to use it to live a healthier life. If there's any questions, please leave them in the comments section below. I do welcome feedback, so please also leave me any comments or suggestions in the comments section. Please subscribe and turn on the notifications, and I hope to see you at the next episode. Until then, stay healthy and stay educated.